Good evening. It is March 18th, 2019, 5:15 p.m. We have a quorum present, and so we will call the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for the City of Louisville to order. First item on the agenda is to approve the minutes of the March 5th meeting. Commissioners, do we have any comments, questions, or a motion for approval?
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Mary Ellen and a second by Karen. All those in favor signify aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Item 3 on the agenda is the public hearing for consent agenda plats. I'll be reading all 5 of these at the same time, and then we will have one public hearing for all 5 items, unless there's anyone who would like to pull one of these off of the consent agenda. Commissioners? Hearing no, I'll read all 5 of them. Agenda item 3A is a public hearing for final plat of Valley Square Addition, lots 2R and 7, Block A, containing 2 commercial lots on 3.744 acres located on the south side of West Main Street, approximately 300 feet west of Edmonds Lane, being a replat of Valley Square Addition, Lot 2. Agenda item 3B is a public hearing for final plat of Xander Place Addition, lots 3R-1, 4, and 5, Block A, containing 3 commercial lots on 3.77 acres, located on the east side of State Highway 121 Business, approximately 900 feet south of Metro Park Boulevard, being a replat of Xander Place Addition, Lot 3R, Block A. Agenda item 3C is a public hearing for final plat of South Ridge Addition, lots 20R-2, 25, and 26, Block I, Phase 1, containing 3 commercial lots on 12.38 acres, located on the northeast quadrant of FM 3040 and Edmonds Lane, being a replat of South Ridge Addition, lot 20R-1, Block I, Phase 1. Agenda item 3D is a public hearing for final plat of National Indoor Storage, Lot 1R, Block A, containing 1 commercial lot on 13.4232 acres, located on the east side of State Highway 121 Business, approximately 1,100 feet north of South Mill Street, being a replat of National Indoor Storage Addition, Lot 1R, Block A, and Auto Master Addition, Lot 1, Block A. Agenda item 3E is a public hearing for final plat of Hedrick School Addition, Lot 1R, Block A, containing 1 non-residential lot on 24.161 acres, located on the south side of Bel Air Boulevard, approximately 350 feet east of South Old Orchard Lane, being a replat of Hedrick School Addition, Lot 1, Block A.
Good evening, Commissioners. These are all replats of non-residential property. I do want to bring to your attention that no variances are being requested, or all variances have been previously approved by City Council. Owners for the Valley Square Addition, South Ridge Addition, and National Indoor Storage Addition are currently traveling and unable to sign the plats. So we're recommending that those be approved with the condition that owner signatures are obtained. And the Hedrick School Addition needs an avigation release, which the school board is meeting on this evening to approve that. So that would be approved with the condition that the avigation release is provided. So staff's recommendation is that the Planning and Zoning Commission approve the plats as presented with the condition that signatures are provided for the Valley Square Addition, South Ridge Addition, and National Indoor Storage Addition, and that the avigation release is provided for the Hedrick School Addition. And you can have one public hearing and make one motion to approve these plats with those conditions.
Okay. Commissioners, do we have any questions before we open the public hearing? Okay. Do you have a question?
I was just going to ask, is Hedrick in the flight plan or something, plane or something?
Yeah, so we require an avigation release based on zones, and they're actually noise contours. So basically, if you're within a certain noise contour from DFW Airport, when you plat a property, you have to file an avigation release acknowledging that you understand that you're within a certain noise contour, and that could be, it could impact your property, and you might want to, put in thicker windows or something to mitigate for that.
Okay. Okay, with no further questions, we will open the public hearing on agenda items 3A through 3E. Anyone wishing to speak on any of these items may come forward at this time. So with no one coming forward, we will close the public hearing. Commissioners, do we have any discussion or a motion for approval? And I think, again, Michelle said that we could do one motion as to recommending approval as she read with the conditions.
So I can make a motion to approve as presented with the contingencies on the signatures and the aviation approval by the board.
Okay, so that's a motion by John.
Second.
Second by Karen. All those in favor signify aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, Commissioners. That is the final action needed on those plats. None of them need to go before the City Council.
Okay, and with that, the next item on the agenda is adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Motion by Mary Ellen,
Second.
second by William. All those in favor signify aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.
The meeting of the PZ and the council to order. We do have a quorum present. And who else?
Richard Scotty.
Richard, go ahead.
Good evening, Mayor Durham and members of the council, Chairman Green and members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. We appreciate all of you coming together tonight. We've got our consultant team assembled, and they will be giving you an overview and an update on our zoning and development code overhaul, which is well underway. And we'll also be seeking some direction towards the end of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to our consultant team of Karen Walls with Strategic Community Solutions, Mark Bowers with Kimley Horn, and Phyllis Gerald with City-Centric Planning. Karen?
Good evening. It's great to be here with you, and we're looking forward to a really productive discussion. We appreciate you going along with us on this unusual kind of a format. I'll be explaining a little bit later what it was that we wanted to do and how we feel like this is going to be the most effective thing for us. Before we get into our overall presentation, though, I did want to take a minute to let the council members know how much I missed not being able to be at your retreat with you this year.
Oh, we missed you.
Because I was, as Donna knows, I was in a long ways away from here. I was on a ship in Antarctica, and it was a little hard to come back and forth. but I know that you had a really great, productive session. Donna and I've already visited about it. I'm looking forward to continuing to work forward on that and continuing all the great stuff that you all are doing here in Louisville. So one of which is obviously this program that we want to talk to you about this evening. And all three of us are going to be doing parts of the presentation, kind of going back and forth. We want this to be a very productive and informal discussion, more so than presentation. And so to kick that off and do the beginning of the slideshow, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Bowers. I think all of you all have, or I know the council members, I believe, have met Mark, and actually all of you have when we did the area plan. So Mark Bowers and Phyllis Gerald and I are very pleased to be working with you all again this evening.
Thank you, Karen. And I'm going to start off by running through the agenda that we set up for the afternoon. So we want to start off by going through the input we've received to date and some of the sources of that input. We'll step through several areas of the preliminary direction. We've broken that out into subcategories that we're going to walk through with you in some detail, get some feedback from you related to that direction. And then we'll come back and recap what we heard from you and talk about next steps and where we'll be going, where we'll be headed with all of this information. So it's related to the input to date. We kicked off the project back in December. We started off just receiving input with city staff and talking about how we're going to be approaching the project, talking at a high level about some of the issues that folks were dealing with related to the existing codes. And then on the 24th of January, we went into focus group sessions. We had sessions with future developers. Those were the folks that aren't currently developing in Louisville, but we wanted to talk to them about what were some of the reasons for that and what are some things you might be looking for and ideas they have related to the code. Current developers, design professionals, community leaders, and then we also met with a code review committee made up of multiple departments within the city to vet some of the issues that they're dealing with some diagnostic meetings. We had 2 of those diagnostic meetings. And there were some common themes that really came out of the information we've been hearing throughout. A couple of those are that we heard across the board from folks that they felt the ordinances were antiquated, that it was not uncommon for people to be asking for variances to the code in the development process. And we heard quite a bit about the potential and the thought that PD should be allowed on smaller sites. With Louisville headed into a lot of areas that are more focused on redevelopment or smaller sites, you don't have a lot of the big greenfield areas left to develop necessarily. So the thought was that a PD might be a good approach to some of those more difficult sites going forward. There was an interest from many people that we talked to at looking at reducing parking requirements, so we want to talk to you about that some. And we heard quite a bit that the screening requirements are complicated and sometimes inconsistent around the city. So those were just a handful of the things that we heard from the interviews. We have pages and pages of notes from them, but to continue forward, I'd like to ask Karen to start walking through the direction that we've heard and some of the feedback that you have for that.
So as Mark just said, we have pages and pages and pages of details that we've heard from people about what's working nicely well, what could be changed, what we're not thinking about yet, all those things. And obviously, we are not going to go through all of that with you this evening. But what we wanted to do is identify a couple of key topics for which we really would like to get some discussion and initial direction tonight. And as I think we want to emphasize, we're not asking you to take any kind of formal votes this evening, but what we wanted to do, out of all of the things that we've heard about, we've identified a few key topics for which we'd like to get some early feedback so we know we're heading in generally a good direction. And we don't spin our wheels a lot or do a lot of research and then find out it was something you weren't really interested in. So we want to get that from you this evening. And so this is the time that we plan to use, and I know our time is very short, so we wanted to concentrate on those issues that were the most important. So as we go through, we're going to very briefly explain the issue. Phyllis is going to summarize that really quickly and summarize our preliminary recommendation on that issue. So we're saying, here's what we think is a good approach for you all. Here's why we think that. Here's what we think the benefits are. And then in some cases, there's some examples. Once we have had that brief presentation, then I'm going to facilitate a discussion with y'all, and I have a set of questions to sort of guide that discussion so that we can have that dialogue. And I'm going to be looking at all of you equally as far as comments and questions and suggestions and so forth as we go through that part of the presentation. So our objective is that when we leave here tonight, we've got a sense of the things that are most critical to you, or of greatest interest, or things that you perhaps really aren't that interested in, so that we can be beginning our drafting work appropriately for you and to do things effectively. So this is obviously a different format than usual kinds of meetings, so I wanted to introduce it. We feel like this is going to help us all make the most effective use of the time that we have with you all this evening. And again, as I say, informal discussion, no formal votes, and no formal actions. Is that comfortable for everybody? Okay with all of that? Okay, great. Well, with that then, we have 5 of these big topics that we've identified for tonight. And so Phyllis is going to kick us off on the first one of those.
Well, I've been immersed now for several months in your ordinances, and I think I finally found all of them.
Could you let me know?
They are scattered, as y'all probably well know, as you've worked with them, all through the Code of Ordinances. And so I think that's one of the things we've talked a lot with staff is what would be the best format and the best way to organize all these many ordinances that you have so that they're usable for everyone. You can find them, the developers know where to find things, commission, council, and they're clear and easily understandable for folks. So that's really one of the things we've been focusing on as our first topic, because we don't want to set off writing this big, huge document, because it's going to be a big one when we get finished with it, without having it well organized and in a format that fits your needs. So, make sure I don't touch it. Very good. We've looked at several different ways of organizing it. Some cities keep their zoning ordinance, their subdivision ordinance separate. Some cities have unified development codes. Some cities put all their ordinances in one big notebook and call that a unified code. But that's what we're talking about, and our recommendation is to unify the land development code, the Old Town ordinance, the zoning ordinance, all of those, and pull them into one document. It's going to be easier for everyone to use, find the information, eliminate duplication. We've found some inconsistencies already as you start comparing the different codes, because they were all developed separately over a long period of time. And then the other thing we want to do is use more charts, graphs, and tables in the new ordinances, because it's easier to read, easier to find the information, and I think it looks better, not as text heavy as your current ordinance is now. There are a lot of cities that use unified development codes. Arlington in this area, Denton, they're in the process of adopting a new unified code. San Marcos just adopted one last year. So this is not unusual format. But right, again, with the unified codes, and I'll give you an example here. We've kind of done a preliminary table of contents. And these would be the main articles. Again, you'll see some very familiar ordinances and codes in this table of contents, and obviously would have subchapters under each of these major headings. And some of them are interchangeable. You could pull them out separately if you wanted to do that. The two areas that I would note that will be probably the most combined would be definitions, where we would take all of your land development definitions, your zoning definitions. I did it, didn't I? But let's go back. So we would take those and put them in one chapter, and the same thing for review procedures. So you would have in that your site plan process, your planning process, the different variances, and who has authority to do what in the ordinance, both for planning and site plan and zoning. So those are the two chapters that really get unified. The others, again, like I said, they're very familiar. I think you'll as to what's in your ordinance already.
I love how 10 is just park development fee. Like there's no other fees, there's nothing else, it's just park development fee, that's the whole chapter.
Again, that's something for discussion. Right now your ordinance does include fees. That's probably something you want to move out of it. So you're not always having to amend your ordinance every time council wants to adopt a new fee schedule for something. And this is an example of what your multifamily 1 district might look like once we take it and we put it in table format. And we're proposing that we have a general format for each one of your zoning districts. We think it'll be much easier to see and actually find the different setbacks and everything. And I just took your existing requirements and put it in this format, just so you can see what it might look like. The land use charts. Right now, each individual district has a list of uses that are allowed. We're proposing that we take all that information and put it into a chart, so it's all in one place. This is, I think, San Marcos's use chart, so I'm just using it as an example, again, so you can see what yours might look like when we're finished with the process. It's easy to read. You can add notes if you need to refer to other supplemental standards. Some cities also add the parking requirements with each use. So again, kind of everything's right there in one place for developers and your staff and you to use.
So Phyllis has tried to give you just the really quick version of what we're talking about when we talk about a unified development code and what we're thinking about in terms of some of the structure and format and organizational aspects. And so this is the question that I'd like to get your feedback, your thoughts, and your direction on. Should the overhaul create a unified development code, bringing all of these regulations into one consolidated document? Does that make sense to you all? Should we pursue that approach, or should we kind of keep them separate, or do some other thing?
Is this a trick question?
No, no, because this is a question where, as Phyllis was indicating, there are a lot of cities that do one, and there are a lot of cities that do the other. So it's not like there's one definite answer, though this is,
Do-
from our
Do
understanding.
the other. Explain to me what that phrase means.
Keep it the way you have it now, where they're separated.
Okay,
Where you've got zoning and you've got subdivision and you've got various other things in other places.
okay, so
Rather than-
unorganized versus organized is the question you're asking.
That's, yes,
Okay, I'm kind of clear on that.
okay.
Well,
Kristen.
I would say the organization that I like to see when I'm looking at a code would be, if I'm gonna do some site development planning, I want one document that's got everything in there that I need to figure out how I'm gonna lay out the site. So what my minimum land area needs to be, what my, my setbacks have to be. The format that you're showing here, I love it. I hate Unicode.
It's kind of
And so, yes, and so with the graphics and all of that, I would love for us to pull everything out of Unicode.
We've heard that from several people.
The-
Phyllis and Mark may well jump in here.
And I assume that the engineering standards would be kind of a separate addendum to this.
Yes, so what we had looked at was under the subdivision ordinance chapter, that's where you would find your engineering standards. You would have zoning, design and development standards would be for zoning, and then in your subdivision regulations, you would have all of the engineering.
Would we maybe want to pull that out as maybe a separate addendum, just because if that needs to be updated?
Yes, and I misunderstood. Your standard details and all that would be separate. They would be referenced and incorporated by reference, but they would be a standalone document because they do change and you do come up with, with things that you want to amend frequently in those.
But like the design standards too, so like when it goes into the paving and, like with your vertical curves and then your drainage and all of that stuff, that's usually also in the engineering design standards. Where would that go?
It would be, for example, the requirements for who has to build your different types of drainage structures. That would be in the ordinance. It would be standard details that would be kind of separately, like, the COG standard details that would sit.
Well, usually like there's a manual that like walks you through calculations and stuff, and I know that those get
That
updated
would
from
be
time to
separate.
time too.
That would be,
That would be separate with the
Yes.
details.
Yeah.
Okay.
As long as it references the addenda.
Yeah, some of the
Like we do with our
things-
fee schedule today.
Yeah.
The things that more
So,
frequently
so
get
some of
changed.
those details now, you've got some of that detail in the ordinance itself, so we think this is gonna make it simpler. So no, this isn't exactly a trick question, but we thought it might be an easy one to start with. So to go back to my question here. There we go. So this is what we're recommending. Are you all comfortable with that as far as the direction right now?
I was excited when you said put everything in 1 3-ring binder. So that, yeah.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to the second topic.
Our second topic's overlay districts, and right now you have 2 overlay districts. You've got the I-35 overlay that was recently adopted, and then you've got the Old Town District, which I consider to be an overlay district, although it's a very different format. So what we're recommending is that the new ordinance have all of those overlay districts contained within them, that they're not separate standalone ordinances elsewhere in the code of ordinances. And we think there's a lot of benefits to this. Again, everything's in one place, so if you're a consultant trying to find what your requirements are, it's gonna be there. Also, what we plan to do is set up a template that can be used for your future overlay districts, because we know there's some anticipated that came out of the small area plans that we did. So we'll try to set this up so you can take that format, and then as you create future overlay districts, that information can slide right in. Now, the Old Town Ordinance, we like to put it on a diet, and kind of pull out the requirements that are specific to Old Town, because I know there's a lot of duplication in that ordinance of just general requirements. And so we would like to pull out that information, reformat it, keep all the requirements, not change anything with that, but to, again, make it part of the overall ordinance. And I think just, again, reviewing what your current overlay districts are. Got I-35, the transition districts, future overlays that we've talked about as part of the small area plans, Old Town North. There's several there because of the different character of the streets and areas in that neighborhood. And then Southwest Louisville, a overlay district for Round Grove Road as that retail corridor continues to develop and redevelop.
Okay, so this hopefully is a fairly straightforward question as well. Do you all feel okay about us bringing all those overlays into this same document so that you don't have Old Town over here and these other things over in other places, that it's all in one location?
Absolutely.
Okay, and also I want to echo again what Phyllis said about Old Town putting on a diet. There's a lot of stuff that it goes through headings about things that are in your main ordinances, and there's no real need to have them in two places when they say exactly the same thing. So that will be part of what we think will help make things work more smoothly. So just want to make sure everybody's clear about kind of that approach. Okay.
Variances, our next topic, and this is one we've studied quite a bit because y'all approve a lot of variances, and honestly in other cities they're relatively rare. I was looking at your council agendas for the last 3 months of 2018, and during that time you approved 23 variances.
I'll take that over lawsuits every day.
I understand.
Look at Mesquite's.
So, you know, what we're looking at is can we restructure that process
I knew you were coming back.
to streamline it so that not every project has to go for several variances, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 6. Yet still maintain the proper level of oversight, because I know the Planning and Zoning Commission wants to be involved, and so does City Council if there's something that is a special request and is deviating from the normal requirements. You want to have some level of oversight. But I think there's a way to restructure this process so that you still have that ability, but you're also delegating some things to staff. When I look at the ordinance, and I look at other cities' ordinances, things like driveway spacing should be something your city engineer can approve. If a developer doesn't agree with his or her decision, then they could appeal then to council. But I'd like to see if there's a way to delegate some more authority to staff, and we would use your I-35 overlay district kind of as a template for that. I know that there's a lot of discussion during that process about what staff can approve, when it has to go to the overlay district board, what has to go to council, what has to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So we kind of use that as the structure, because that I think is one that y'all have come to agreement on and are comfortable with. But again, look at what might be able to be delegated to staff, again, with an appeal to the City Council or Planning and Zoning Commission. But I think there's another part of this, and the fact that you're approving so many variances means your ordinances aren't working for you. And so the first, I think, level of attack is to go in and look at the ordinances. You know, what are frequent ordinance variance requests? I've seen screening walls are a big one. I've seen trees, driveway spacing, and as you start to get into this finer grained development where you're dealing with smaller lots, you're not dealing with greenfield, large properties, it gets tough to apply the standards to some of these properties. And I think we have to keep in mind here too, there's going to be a separate process for waiver of development exactions for your construction requirements, because state law puts the burden on the city to prove that up, that you're requiring a developer to build 4 lanes, and he's saying, my development doesn't require 4 lanes, and why am I having to do this? So there's some things like that need to be clarified in your ordinance. We also have to keep in mind the authority that state law gives to the zoning board of adjustment in approving variances. So all these things we're kind of swirling around right now, but we want to get some direction from y'all tonight. Are you generally comfortable with again delegating authority, some authority to staff, and using I-35 as a template for how they can process variances. Again, here's an illustration of the I-35 process now for variances. I know you've got alternative standards, you've got administrative modifications. I think those are probably good terms to start with as we look at other parts of the ordinance and maybe use that same type of process that's set up in the I-35 district. Again, we're using driveway spacing as an example of something that might be delegated to staff. And a lot of those technical requirements like that the city engineer or your traffic engineers have the knowledge, and expertise to make those decisions, but again, with an appeal to city council.
So I think we're probably gonna have more discussion on this topic. But just to start with, that general concept that Phyllis was sharing about looking at things that are routine, things where you're having frequent requests for the same kind of variance. Can we take a look at ways to have some of that stuff be delegated to staff with some kind of appropriate appeal process, but to look at that as a way to address and make things work more smoothly and effectively? I know you had lots of discussion about the trade-offs and kind of the level of which issues need to come to council, which ones are okay to delegate. As Phyllis said, I think our objective would be to use where you ended up on I-35 as kind of the basic starting point that we'd be looking at in terms of where to draw some of those lines. But we wanted to hear from you all on this one because I know this is really an important topic for all of you and affects what things you all are involved with and reviewing as you go forward.
I think that's something that we definitely will want more detail on each issue as we go through it, because there's some things, that's fine, but then there's some other things that we may run into that we may have some discomfort that we need to work on. So I think I'm fine with going in that route, but I think we need to be presented, a little more detail on each of these areas before we
As to which ones would go with
before we
a
sign off on it,
the delegate.
I want to see that. I was Melly on this the last time too, so I would want to see what we're delegating.
Okay.
I would want to be very clear on what we're delegating and then make a decision on whether that's acceptable or not from a council perspective.
Okay. On the example that Phyllis was using in terms of the driveway spacing, does that seem like something that could reasonably be delegated?
I think the template we have in the overlay, the I-35 overlay district is good. I mean, we went through those pieces and decided which ones we wanted, and we tweaked the numbers and that sort of thing.
And I think what would help is like if we have the number of variances that we're dealing with, and we can kind of go back and look at it ourselves, and we can kind of say, okay, this is something we need to lay back on and let staff do it. That may help to make the decision as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like driveway spacing, if the staff, who are the experts, say approve it, I'm not gonna get my ruler out and go, okay, but it should, if this, they're the experts. If they say approve it, I'm gonna approve it. So.
On the flip side, I like screening walls, and I don't want everything to get delegated down to the lowest common denominator if we can help it. And I think, quite frankly, if we give it all to staff, then you guys lose some leverage, some negotiating leverage at some point. So there's that concept there to use another frequent flyer that comes to council.
Okay. What about those of you on P&Z? And again, I'm not sure how much has come through so far on I-35 to know how that's working yet.
We've had a couple, we just had one, 2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago.
I mean, the landscaping is the big one, we don't really get to really have, we can't vote on the landscaping. I mean, I would hope that with things like driveway spacing, if that's a continual issue, or maybe even parking, is there a way that we're looking at and we're saying, okay, well, if everybody's asking for a variance, are our standards too high? And then we can have council and P&Z and everybody get on the same page about that and the standard, and then nobody has to approve a variance because people can actually meet the standards.
Because you changed the requirement itself.
I think one of the ones we've only done, I think, 2 of them,
And both of those have had color schemes, wanting 4 colors instead of 3. Don't know if that's gonna be a continuing situation or not. That's found 2 of them so far.
It's not a good plat without 4.
Everybody seems to want them. I shouldn't say everybody, 2 people. 2 groups.
Yeah, are there other perspectives on other issues?
I just think because it seems that the main challenge here is redevelopment, not development. So I think it's kind of hard to not have variances just because of I just kind of wonder, are we doing more than other cities in a similar situation? I just, I've had occasions from time to time to have to, deal with the ordinances personally, but and it's not always easy, but that's why I just kind of think that, I just kind of wonder about that, how do you kind of have the ability to grant variances without getting into a situation where maybe somebody doesn't like a decision that we made in one case over another, and putting the city at a disadvantage.
Yeah, Phyllis, could I ask you to just share a little of what you experienced in Plano as you were doing that kind of development?
It was, when I worked in Plano, it was rare that we had variances, and in Plano, variances went to the zoning board of adjustment, for the most part, like 95% of them for zoning. This planning and zoning commission had the authority to approve subdivision ordinance variances. And then the thoroughfare standards ordinance there, the transportation engineer could have approved variances. Again, with appeals, own up the chain, so that, it even had where the planning director could appeal a decision of the planning and zoning commission. And that was kind of scary sometimes, it's not something we want to do very frequently, but, so, every city's a little different, but like I said, the number of variance requests that y'all are processing is very high in my experience. And, there's some, kind of like the first line of attack is look at your ordinances. Can you address some of this by fixing your ordinances? For
And that's the
example,
standards like Kristen was saying.
yeah, if you're requiring a 50-foot setback for retail and office, is there any reason that couldn't be 20 feet? If that's, one of the frequent variance requests.
And if you're always granting it.
Yeah, and so there's some things like that, that we can first scour the ordinance, look at what's being requested frequently for variances and see if we can fix those. Because, as Louisville continues to grow and redevelop and certainly want that to happen, you've got to look at how you make better use of what land you have. And if that means you increase lot coverage, so that a developer has more options there, that it means you reduce setbacks, you reduce parking requirements, which is something we're going to talk about next. But there's several regulatory ways to get at the variance problem first. To make, and we've had a lot of discussion with the city attorney's office about flexibility, and because they're concerned, rightly so, about consistency. Is if you're granting variances to this guy, why, and you don't grant them to the other guy, what was different about those cases that could end up, getting the city in some legal jeopardy if it were challenged. So it's a touchy subject. It's one that we need to parse through carefully just because of the legal implications, the state law requirements, that type of thing. But, and it's probably going to take a lot of discussion to get everyone comfortable with what we're trying to do.
Well, I would be very happy with a lot of this, that it ends at planning and zoning. The P&Z approves it, and then we don't need to see it. Because we pretty much, gosh, in 4 years, what have we not? I think one situation, but they pretty much redid their entire plan to get it redone. So appeals only, in that it's done with planning and zoning.
What do others of you on the council think about
I think that work on make the ordinances consistent and so that we don't have to have a bunch of variances. Like Brent said, we haven't, I can only think of one since I've been on, where we've actually not approved or not, when we've approved something or not approved something that planning and zoning didn't do. But they told us not to follow their road anyway on that one, so.
And sitting on P and Z, that's sometimes what we have to rely on. We have to, here's the rule and we may not like it, but we can't go beyond that. We have you to be able to say, wait a minute.
Yeah.
And that's kind of nice to know, because the one you're talking about is one that I was not really in favor of, but I could find nothing that I could say no to. And so, there are some things, I think the overlay plan might be a good model to start with, but I don't know that it needs to be exactly that same way.
Yeah, and I think Karen, is a good point that that would be a model that we would start with. I'm not sure it needs to be exactly the same, and certainly I know there are some things in there that are pretty complex. And I'm not sure that that's going to be needed throughout everywhere, but we were thinking of it more from the standpoint, I just remember some of the discussions that I heard about, which issues come to, can the staff do, what's P and Z, what's council, what percentage of variation is okay or not okay. Since I know that y'all did spend so much time on kind of figuring out those kinds of percentages and things. I know Richard and the others on the staff have, spent quite a bit of discussion on that those kind of thresholds, I guess, would be, to me, would be something that we would try to take that at least as an initial point for our conversation for this.
And I'm fine with coming from PNC, I'm fine with, delegating more to them. But I still think before the council does that, we want to kind of take a hard look at what we're delegating, so we
What power are we ceding?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
And-
we
and-
may not want it.
Yeah.
That's why you're gonna get.
And on the one here that we haven't really talked about, should there be an appeal process for staff denials? Absolutely. There should always be an appeal process.
Yes. Agreed. Yeah. Okay. All right. That sounds fine. And then using that 35 as a guide for the overlay as well, I guess, is our other concern. Are there other issues that you've been running into with 35 or with any of the other recent issues on delegation?
I don't think we've had enough of the
P and Z, if council says we're happy to have some of these things end at P and Z, is that okay with y'all? Does that feel comfortable? Does that seem reasonable for what you all do?
Oh, everything on P and Z now.
That impact, like, we have to have 2 public hearings, how does that work? We still have to go to council, right?
Well, in terms of your plats and site plans, where you would, a developer might be requesting variance, is that what you're referring to? Yes. I mean, the Planning and Zoning Commission would probably make a recommendation on the variance, and then it would go on to City Council. Although you could structure it where the Planning and Zoning Commission has the final say, but a developer could appeal their decision then to council when it is reviewed. Let's take a look at that. A lot of cities, the councils don't review plats and site plans. They don't take action as stops at the Planning and Zoning Commission. So y'all are a little different in that respect, that everything that goes on to the council for review.
I just want to pipe in and say zoning changes, however, would definitely still require the 2 public hearing process where it's a recommendation from P and Z and then approval by council. That's state
Yes.
law.
As well as SUPs and any ordinance amendments.
New PDs?
Yes,
Yes.
PDs, SUPs.
Yeah. I mean, changing the structure doesn't change things that have some kind of a legal requirement about use of Okay, so what I think I'm hearing at this point from y'all is, yes, we're willing to look at some changes in how things are delegated. That we think there are some things that could be delegated to staff. There are some things that could end at planning commission, planning and zoning, rather than needing to come come to council. I-35 is a good starting point or a good example for us to work from. What I'm also hearing from you all is that as we continue forward and look at the detail, that you'd like to see the listing of kind of, here are the things that we think would still remain at council, here are things that would get delegated in this way or that way, so that you can have a more specific look and discussion and see if you're comfortable with those things. So we're not assuming that it's kind of carte blanche after our discussion tonight, but that we plan to kind of have a more detailed listing and say, here's our kind of first cut at how we might change some of that. I also obviously want to emphasize we're not going to change the hearing processes on things where there's a requirement, but that we would be looking to try to take care of things. And this is actually a second kind of informational request I think I heard, which was to say, if we've got this list of issues that we might delegate down, how many variances are involved with those right now? Which ones are getting a lot of variances, which ones are kind of minor, which ones are taking up lots of time or not taking up lots of time. So I think that's another kind of background piece that we would want to try to come back to you with. Does that make sense? Good on all those? And again, there's obviously lots more detail to come, but we wanted to, obviously we didn't want to even start on looking at some of those kinds of questions if we're going to come back and find out that you say, no, we just want to keep all the variances just like they are today. So I'm going to go forward with that. Okay.
Those? Parking. I know this is a topic that's always front and center on a lot of people's minds. I know there are developers out there that are like giddy at the prospect of not having to build parking garages because of autonomous vehicles and all of that. Personally, I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon. I think we're probably decades away from that, but we hear a lot of discussion in the development community about parking. But I think there's some things that the city can look at in the interim that would kind of amend your parking requirements, maybe provide less parking. I know that's been a topic of discussion. Shared parking between different uses, there are always opportunities there to share between like office and theaters, religious assembly. There's some things that we can look at in that standpoint. If you're reducing your parking requirements, you're opening up development opportunities because maybe an aging shopping center that's redeveloping now can get another pad site or two to help support the finances for that redevelopment. So, there are a lot of reasons to look at reducing your parking. It's helping with your stormwater runoff, but not having all those paved surfaces. And there are things that you can do, look at from a regulatory standpoint. If you do reduce your parking, and a lot of developers are still going to want to come in and provide more than what you're requiring. But you could, some cities have hard caps. I know Denton until recently you had to provide no more and no less than what the city's requirement was. Now I think in their current review of their ordinances, they're proposing to let developers go to 125% of the minimum requirement. So trying to free that up. There are other cities that require, if you go over your minimum required parking, you have to increase your landscape requirements. So that's another option to look at. There's some cities that require permeable paving. So if your development requires 100 spaces by the city's code, you want to provide 150. Those additional 50 spaces get put in as permeable paving. So there are a lot of things that we can look at as we go through this particular requirement. We put together a comparison just so y'all could see kind of where you fit with some of the surrounding cities in terms of retail parking. And in general, y'all require more parking for retail uses than most of the surrounding cities. It gets up to 1 to 200, which is kind of standard. I know y'all are proposing a new standard, I think with the interim updates, that would place it at 1 to 200, or 200 square feet. But you see Arlington is 1 for every 333 square feet. Carrollton actually has a cap on their shopping center requirements. Frisco again goes up and then back down. McKinney 1 to 250, Plano is 1 to 250 if you get over 50,000 square feet. So those are pretty typical parking requirements that we're seeing around the metropolitan area. But I think every city is looking at how they better manage parking. So this effort fits right in with what other cities are doing, and I know the topics, it's an issue for y'all as you, again, get down to these redevelopment infill properties.
So as we're looking at parking, we're looking at doing some things to change the way that it's currently handled. And as Phyllis said, I know we've heard that that's been a topic for you all as well. These are some of the things that we're thinking might be the most important for us to be considering as we're looking at the updates. And so I just be anxious to hear from y'all if these things seem like good approaches for us to be considering. If there's something else about parking and about how it's working now that we ought to consider, that really ought to be an important part of how we update this. As Phyllis said, many of the other cities around the region are requiring less parking than y'all are. Some of them are requiring putting a cap or creating some other disincentives. The issues of shared parking, reducing amount of paved area, so using other kinds of techniques instead of just paving everything over. And I know that ties back to your sustainability interests, obviously. New forms of transportation, we're thinking of things like Uber and Lyft and zip cars and so forth. And do you want to build some of that consideration into your approach to parking? Reuse of current parking, as Phyllis is saying, there's a lot of discussion in the development community about what's going to happen with autonomous vehicles, whether it's going to be more need for parking, less need for parking, what different kinds of parking, different needs in different locations. Part of the outgrowth of all of that is the thinking that as we look at building things like surface parking or parking garages, we should be thinking about that as an interim use with the opportunity for some future redevelopment later on. Is that a factor to consider? So there's a lot going on in this subject around the region and around the country, and we just wanted to share a little of that with you and make sure we understand the things that you're seeing and thinking about that we ought to be considering as we look at this topic.
I don't want to get into a situation that we're under parking everything, and that's what Denton got into.
Okay.
And I was involved in one of them, we were trying to add 60 more spots because the police officers were telling us, if you didn't get the people off the streets, we're going to start ticketing everybody.
Okay.
So, okay, we go in there, and then the city came back and said, no, you can't have any more. As a matter of fact, you already have 100 spots, and we're going to reduce that down to 75. Which didn't make any sense. Finally got the police department over there and they started talking. The whole idea was that the people had no idea what the uses of the facility were and the turnover.
Okay, so that the requirements that the city was using didn't relate to the actual.
They weren't really concerned if it was zoned medical being used as office. It was one number and vice versa.
Okay. So concerned about not getting into a situation where you're short on parking.
Yeah, and if the property owner wants to build more because they think their customers demand it or need it, I don't see the need to come back and go, no, we're going to cut it from what you have now, much less what you might have in the future. And also they'd say, we're going to force people into buses. We're going to force people into mass transit of other things. And you go, they had a bus line out here before and it was shut down. And then they brought it back and then shut it down. So people are going, I'm not going to get rid of my car so I can ride the bus every day.
I don't think we have any district that I can think of that we need a cap on. I may be wrong. I mean, I see that more like in redevelopment areas or, Deep Ellum or something like that.
But wouldn't that be from the property owner's standpoint?
Well, and that's what I'm saying, that we don't need to put caps, that if even in Old Town, if they think they need more spaces, they want to buy the land to build more spaces because they think they need it.
What about these shopping centers on Main Street, that they have all this parking and the shops are way down in there?
Right.
I don't think that they look good.
Well, it is, there's part of that at look, and that is a concern that for a lot of cities comes into play in terms of walkability and desirability of people who want to go to that shop or whatever. They don't want to walk across a big sea of empty parking. If it's, the old thing of, the parking lot is built so that it only gets used on the day after Thanksgiving.
Well,
maxed
something
out.
you said earlier too about using then some of that parking, putting down another pad. Now you're blocking the view to those shops back there. They're not gonna be happy about that either. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I don't like the way they look, where there's just, and I think it's almost, there's like 3 of them in a row, where it's just all this parking.
Are you thinking about a particular part of town?
Yeah, it's all over on Main Street, on the west side, and there's one at Edmonds and Main. There's one that's at Valley and Main, and there's one at Oak Orchard and Main. And they're all on the south side, and they just have a sea of parking, and then the shops are way back.
If you made that more walkable, you had trees and things to make it more appealing, that might be a solution.
Yeah, I think
That's-
aesthetically that would look much
Yeah, it
nicer.
would be nicer, a much better look,
Yeah.
and I think those are some of the things that.
Because I think sometimes I think like, well, there's nobody's parking here. Are these shops any good? Does anybody ever come here?
Right.
Well, yeah, they do, but they don't get it all the way back here.
Well, and also I know a lot of the research in terms of health and healthy lifestyles and attracting customers to shops, and if people have to walk through a long distance that's empty or boring, or, unclear what they're doing or why they're there or nobody
I
else
would
is
ask
around,
them
that
that,
it
why are they
doesn't
walking
always.
through empty spots?
Yeah, well, just big parking
I know, but
areas, that's what,
if they're filled up, then it's full.
right.
If they're empty, which is what was said, that's another thing. Why did they park way out there when these are empty? Are they not being able to use them? Are they restricted from using? There's some places that put all their employees can park closer than their customer. It's another issue.
Well, I think that reducing the paved area and redoing some of the landscaping in those giant parking lots. So the mall is a sea of asphalt. And breaking that up with either
I think
landscaping
you got
or
a problem
whatever.
there because they can't rent what they have,
Exactly.
much less
But that's not,
if there's any more they're gonna have to do.
I mean, that's something that's already there, and we're not putting a cap on them. Because, I mean, if
Yeah, I
somebody
don't
came in
think
and
cap
said, hey, we're gonna do it, I mean, that's a redevelopment issue, not a parking issue, because it's right
Correct.
there.
But I'm thinking that should be encouraged as we redevelop.
Right.
And that's, I think, one of the options that Phyllis was suggesting of, if you've got, here's the standard, and people say, well, we'd like to provide more than that you could say, that's fine, but along with that, we want you to have some additional landscaping. That keeps it from being just a gigantic
I
area.
mean, as far as so I don't like to do anything that restricts the market, as far as, I wouldn't be supportive of a cap. But, if somebody, I personally feel like our parking standards are too high. It's gonna get us a bunch of parking that doesn't get used, it's just too high. So I would love to see that number come down to be more in line with what other cities in the Metroplex are doing. But I think that what's gonna, our stormwater fees, that's going to be their incentive to not put in 100 extra spaces, because they're gonna have to pay for that on a monthly basis going forward. It's gonna make their costs higher, it's gonna make that, whatever tenant they wanna put in that space, that's a disincentive for them to do that.
Yeah, it'll incentivize permeable space or more green space.
But if a Costco comes in and they say, we need these parking spaces, I trust them
I mean, we've
because
had that already on the
they need 'em.
I-35 overlay.
Yeah.
We've had, what was it, the shooting range that was coming in. And, we were like, this is more parking than we require. Are you sure you need this? I'm like, yes, we do. We have other stores, we need this parking. And so, it's, the market is telling us what they need.
Flip side, we've had a few come through where they've wanted to go below what the standard was because they didn't feel they were gonna use it, which I thought was, where that low parking concerns me is not in retail, it concerns me in residential, multifamily. Cause I hear stories regularly about, I don't have a place to park my car and I rent here. I mean, this is my home, I have to park my car. And so in my mind, it's structure, I don't wanna disincentivize, parking garages. But that's a density thing, right? So for me, the retail, I've seen both stories, but I agree with you, let the market come in and tell us what that is. Shared parking, I thought is interesting, but when a use changes or the owner changes, then you're back to square one and you're underparked massively. So I don't know how much I wanna build that into regulation. Cause, if that church suddenly becomes a
Movie theater.
movie theater,
Well, but the Mason Church,
Or
they just
vice
went
versa.
down the street and just said, oh, we're gonna use the church, we can use the church across the street. Well, what about Sunday? There are people that live there, can't park on Sunday?
You have to be really careful with shared parking, because it's got to be uses that there's not a
compatible.
big time overlap.
Why don't we call it complementary parking? That they, if you had a church that was always meeting at the same time, and I can't think of something else, but something that only met, and only had people in it 3 days a week. That's the complementary deal, and there's, some of those can work. But if you ever get them conflicting, it doesn't work at all. Or they go to valet and then you
Office space.
run people off, yeah.
One of the things is
First Baptist Church in Dallas is a good example of that.
One of the things that has been happening with multifamily in some other cities is as rents have increased, suddenly you have roommates sharing a one-bedroom apartment. And if you've reduced the parking to one space, per bedroom, then suddenly you've got two tenants with two cars. And it's very tricky to calibrate that, especially in areas like Old Town, where you would expect a more dense, walkable environment. You can't impose your suburban parking requirements and have that environment. So those are usually areas where the cities have lowered parking requirements, but then they're running up against this issue that the rents are so high that people can't, they're having to double up to afford the apartments. And, those things are just hard to manage.
A family with two teenagers, you got 4 cars.
That's true.
But going back to the retail on Main, because I pass it every day because I live over there. I mean, it's always a sea of parking, except at the Winco. The Winco's used. But it would be nice to find a way to incentivize. I wouldn't mandate by trying to reduce parking, but try to incentivize them. I think Kristen hit on a good point, is the permeable space. If they use that space in a more desirable way where the water can actually get through and it costs them less money, we can find a way to work with them to do that. Not necessarily mandating it, but if we can get one on board and they can see what happens, then maybe that's something that'll carry over to other, because we have at least 4 that I'm thinking of that are open all the time. A couple on around Grove and 2 on Main, but I don't think saying you have to reduce to this is necessarily the best way to do it. I think this is one where we need the carrot, not the stick.
I agree that if the company thinks they need those spaces, then they're willing to pay for it.
I think where you have a problem with some of those, it worked 25, 30 years ago when it was built, which that was the way it was supposed to be. Now those uses aren't there anymore. They're going from a full-service grocery store to a thrift store. And they don't need as many parking spots.
A lot of them are just empty, still in a couple of those centers.
Yeah. And some of them haven't been filled in a long time.
Are we gonna talk, parking for restaurants too, cause?
Sure,
Is it all down?
Phyllis's example was for retail, any kind of parking for any of the uses, we'd love to hear about your perspectives on that.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was just curious, with the retail being what it is, could we evaluate what is the actual demand for retail parking now? Because with online, things have changed a lot in retail. Is the parking requirement, does it need to be the same? Because I don't think anybody in the Metroplex is really adjusted for that.
And that might be a good thing with those owners to pull them in and get some feedback.
Incentivize.
There are studies done by Urban Land Institute, traffic engineers. Sometimes they don't have a lot of different samples, so it's you kind of have to be cautious of using those, but there are recommendations out there for parking requirements that are based on actual observation. I read recently Granite Properties, and owns a lot of office buildings in this area. They did a survey of their 23 properties, and they found that while they were providing like one space for every 300 square feet, the actual use at peak times is more like, one space for every 500 square feet. So there are things out there like that we can rely on to kind of calibrate that, but it's not an exact science at all, as y'all well know, as usage.
Then you get into the underparking, in which, to me, that's worse. Because then you have parking situations where people are parking where they shouldn't be. They're parking on the grass, doing all that.
Parking in the neighborhood.
And the malls got into a situation. They had to figure out the worst day of parking the day after Thanksgiving. And that's what they built for. And they don't need that anymore, to say the least.
Right, and when you look at the development trends around the country, the malls that were built like that are transforming all of that, because what they're finding is that today's shoppers don't want to come to a mall that looks that way. That's that bunch of buildings in the middle of that sea of asphalt. So they're coming back in lots of examples with development that is more pedestrian oriented, and that is not, giving up so much of the land to the car.
So they're gonna give more up for space, for more retail, but that really hadn't jumped out there yet. I mean, they may put a movie theater in, something like that, but there's not more retail coming in.
No, but other uses
Or
are
restaurants.
coming, other uses are coming in as well.
Because they're still building at Vista Ridge on restaurant pads that were set aside 30 years ago. And then redeveloping some things. And then not knowing what to do with the empty stores inside.
Other aspects of parking, what I'm hearing from you at this point is it's worthwhile to look at where the regulations are higher than in the surrounding communities, that we ought to take a look at getting more in line with current practice, that we don't want to have something like a cap. We really want to let the market determine how much parking, if somebody's coming in and wanting additional parking. We'd like to look at, you already have, in some ways, some incentives to use pervious paving and other more sustainable approaches, and so some kind of
I
incentive.
still think it's different looking at existing properties versus brand new. If you're looking at, Prosper and stuff like that, they can figure all that stuff out. This one, we've got 1,000 parking spots that aren't being used in this shopping center. What do you do with it?
And that's where the challenge
Do you
comes.
spend a lot of money on it? The answer should be no.
But that's where the challenge comes in, if the owner of that property wants to redevelop it.
Right.
Are you how is the city's ordinance going to address parking? And so if there are things about the ordinance today that's saying you're gonna have to use up a lot more land for parking spaces, that person may say, I can't afford to redevelop it. So,
Well, that's what the
that's
ordinance-
part
I
of
think we need to
that's
change
part of
that.
that's part of that trade-off of doing that, and as Chris said, as you're looking at more and more redevelopment, it's not just those existing uses, but it's also not those greenfield things like Prosper or somebody like that is dealing with. And so that's where I think the examples Phyllis is sharing are ones where it's more nuanced, I guess. It's more fine-tuned about that. But I'm hearing from you all, look at the market, let the market establish things. You're not really wanting to see things that are caps or those kinds of disincentives. The ideas of looking at ways to encourage pervious paving or landscaping and other things as part of those requirements is worth considering. Is that a fair statement? The skepticism about the shared parking, recognizing this, it's really got to be, we need to look at that very carefully if we're proposing.
If it works, it's great.
Yeah, when it works.
Yeah, right.
It's true of everything.
Right, yeah.
Problem is it changes with ownership.
Right.
Or use.
So are you finding though that, kind of like what Kristen touched on is, like I go to pick up. I don't go to walk.
Yeah, right. So you're not using that parking
I'm in-
space for as
I'm in and
long
out.
as you might have in the past.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as soon as I walk in, I'm looking to get
Yeah.
out. So,
And if I'm getting my stuff from Amazon, or if, Whole Foods is delivering stuff to my door, I'm not going to the shopping center at
well,
all.
I'm too cheap to pay for the shipping, so, so usually I put it in and go
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah.
And I'll hit like 2 or 3 places.
Sure.
I park, go, and I'm out.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you really need, day after Thanksgiving parking to the same degree that you do that you did before.
That's what people have found.
So would it, kind of like, say I guess kind of similar to what it sounds like the long-term plan for the folks that own or Zion, it looks like that they're gonna probably in the plan to add to that extra parking space that they took, right? Eventually they're gonna probably develop that for retail, I suppose. That's what it
What
sounds
was the
like to
question
me.
again?
So it seems like, excuse me, say that adjacent parking lot that the owners at Zion took, because that's the most recent thing that we had. It seems to me that they're gonna probably develop that adjacent lot for some kind of retail at some point.
Donna?
It has to go to council again, so that.
I'll throw that out there. They will develop it if they can, but right now, I would imagine they're looking at buying the whole thing and other shopping centers.
And we
If
we
they've
have
got cash.
we have a
in their pocket.
redevelopment plan that encourages less parking there, so, I
Right,
mean,
but that's what I'm saying, like, if you have like smaller space, catering to those spots, I guess, then, doesn't that give a little bit of flexibility in the city too? Because now you don't have like a 50,000 foot empty space, for a couple of years.
Yeah, but when Zion gosh, I don't know where we're going down this too, but when Zion opens, it's like, I can't find a parking spot when I go to H Mart. I have to park and, around the
Take
corner.
an Uber.
Pretty much, yeah, because H Mart's already full, so hopefully Zion, when they finish, their parking lot's gonna be full.
they can always buy a little trolley and go around like they do in Anaheim.
Or give, like
You walk.
if you have if you are Ubering, or, say you've got, I don't know, one of the buses from the hotels or something like that, give them priority. So this way, because they're not gonna be staying, so just let them in and out, but.
That's where the designated drop-off and pickup spot,
Sure.
it comes into play, and that's a good thing.
But that's part of the
Hotel
question
buses
actually,
and
with
things like
the facilitating new forms of transportation, that rather than simply saying you have to provide this much parking, that maybe there should be incentives if a development is making it easier for people to do things like that, like having those drop-offs.
And hopefully redevelopment of the parking lots.
Karen, I'm
something
sorry,
else.
we're kind of running out of time. We probably have
Yep.
about 10 more minutes.
I think we've got one thing left on,
Okay.
so I think we're probably fine.
Sorry.
Okay, anything else on parking? Okay,
Infill and redevelopment, save the best to last. And this ties in with a lot of our prior discussion tonight. How do you facilitate infill and redevelopment? Looking at streamlining procedures, because you want to keep the city attractive to developers. It keeps your tax base up. If you can have new development coming in, redevelopment, you're putting underutilized and undeveloped properties to use. But there are always barriers to infill and redevelopment because the standards you put in place for greenfield just don't work for a lot of infill and properties. So cities address this in several ways. Some cities adopt a redevelopment overlay, so they have an area that they know is experiencing redevelopment pressure. So they go in and build the flexibility into an overlay district. That's always one option. There's some things you probably could do today that might make infill and redevelopment easier. I mentioned earlier, reducing setbacks, increasing lot coverage. I know in Plano, one of the areas where we first noticed a problem was the school district wanting to build onto their elementary schools. They were in residential zoning districts. We had a 35% lot coverage, and that didn't work for a new elementary school. So you have to kind of gauge your ordinances, pay attention to them. What are the barriers, and look at, are there ways to change those things that will make infill development and redevelopment easier for developers. So, we'll be looking at a lot of different techniques, and one of the things that we've heard a lot about, both from staff and from the focus groups, was requiring an engineering site plan, bringing older properties up to today's standards, and when should that kick in? So that's one of the things to look at, because that can really be a deterrent to a developer or a small business that wants to expand, but then we're saying, well, no, you've got to add parking and you've got to, you give up your driveways and bring things up to current standards. It's always a lauded goal, but it's not always possible to do that. So those are kind of some of the things that we want to work through with y'all and get a little initial direction from you tonight. So what level of flexibility needs to be built into the ordinance and into your procedures so that you can better accommodate your infill and redevelopment. I know y'all are already seeing a lot of these properties, this type of development in the city. Here's some examples.
Okay, this is my ignorance. Can we do that with an SUP?
SUP's a little different. That targets the intensity or the impact uses have on an area, where I think I-35 would be a good example of addressing redevelopment issues, building in that flexibility, trying to find that right balance, because you have the extremes. There's so many different scenarios. You cannot write an ordinance that meets every scenario. Again, it's building in that flexibility. Usually starts with.
But why am I doing PDs and SUPs? Why can't I cover that with and a variance? Why can't I cover that in an SUP? We've covered just about everything I can think of in an SUP. Right down to the color of the dog they can have in the front porch.
You're talking zone.
Yeah.
Plan development is zone.
Okay.
SUP is not zone.
So that's the underlying.
That's the difference.
But I can still capture a whole bunch of that in the SUP, if not all of it.
You tend to get enhancements. But a planned development gives you a lot of flexibility, especially where we have some of these odd-shaped pieces that have problem issues. We've been able to come in and use the planned development, and that includes setbacks and all those type of issues.
But I can do that with an SUP and a variance.
The SUP is only gonna be required for certain uses
Right.
depending on the zoning district, so it's
Right,
not gonna apply to every.
but I can tack a variance on there and get it in the same direction, right?
If you want a bunch of variances.
Which we really
So what's the difference between a bunch of variances and a bunch of PDs?
A lot, because a PD is really an adopted plan. And then you.
And
get
it's a
this-
variance from the normal plan.
From the normal zoning.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm just not, I'm not understanding the difference. Yeah, but so is a variance. A variance is a customized zoning for that property. I mean, they asked for that.
A variance isn't gonna necessarily apply to the zoning standards, and there's a long process that the applicants have to go through for a PD, where a variance can be much simpler and much more straightforward. They might not have to spend as much time or money.
Right.
To get that through.
You just sold me on doing more variances. I mean, because what we're trying to do is streamline and speed up the process.
Exactly.
So why would we go to PDs if it's gonna lengthen it out?
So there's always gonna be instances where you're gonna have issues with the codes that you just can't get over, and so the PD then creates a really nice safety valve. So if you can't get over the variances, or maybe there is something that's a setback in use or height issue, that you can't give a variance to per state law, then you could go a PD route to overcome that. But the idea would not be to necessarily do them all over the place, but to have that as a safety valve.
And this, what comes to mind with this is our thriving neighborhoods. We have to make it simple enough for the homeowner that wants to change where he lives without leaving his property. We've got to make it simple enough for them.
Is that not what we're talking about here, is something that's a little more, that what you're saying is what triggers when we have to start looking at, now you gotta do an engineering site plan and you gotta make sure that all your infrastructure is up to our current code. Cause I know when we were looking at 35, when they initially expanded it, we had different categories, based on what their impact was from the 35 expansion. And so some of them didn't necessarily require you to get, if the right of way was taken through here, you had to get this updated, but you don't necessarily have to take care of everything that's out of compliance because there was a different trigger. Is that what your question is, or are we talking about PDs?
I think it's all of the above. There are a lot of different ways to address this. A planned development district, I know y'all have a 5-acre cap, which has come up as a problem because a lot of these properties are smaller and, there are ways that you can just remove that cap. But, the PD is going to allow you to essentially craft a set of regulations that applies to that development and that property. You adopt a development plan that goes along with that, so everyone is clear from the start as to what the development's going to be. You use SUPs in a way different from a lot of other cities. Some cities will not let you do variances. You can make things more restrictive through an SUP process, but you can't grant variances. So again, a little different spin y'all have on processes here.
So is the reason we want to do a PD, because what have we lost? That if we had a PD, we would have gotten it. We would have made that happen with a PD.
Well, can I say something about PDs? Because I do land entitlement in downtowns. That's what I do. And I have to do a PD for almost every single one, and I hate it. I hate it.
It's to me, it slows the process down.
Oh, it is. It takes forever to get it approved, and it is so painful. I would love to be able to not have to do it. Well, I mean,
When something doesn't fit.
well, nothing fits in downtown.
Right.
So,
Right.
So obviously I've had to do a PD on a site that was less than an acre. And everything in it is a variance.
Except that when you're doing that, you have a PD that's just for that instead of
Right.
a list of individual
But it took me
variances
6
and
months
so
to get a PD done.
We're gonna have to
Yeah.
continue this discussion at some other point. And we're gonna go down to looking at the agenda, and then whatever was gonna come after this, it'll be a later date.
So I think they're about to wrap up on this presentation, Mayor, and then we will go to the next
So
meeting.
you need some more time to wrap it up right now?
I think about probably,
2 or 3 more minutes, if we could do that.
well, what I'm hearing from y'all on the questions here about the infill and redevelopment is that there's probably a lot of these topics where we need to have a longer or more detailed discussion about the trade-offs and the pros and cons on those. So, if we assume that that's the case, then I think that our other item to wrap up on is just to kind of tell you where we're heading next.
Yeah, so really the final slide that we had was next steps. So on the 2nd of April, we'll be going back to the Code Review Committee with the final diagnostic meeting, looking at the zoning ordinance and understanding a little bit more from staff, some of the issues they've been dealing with. We'll begin preparation of that draft zoning ordinance. CRC meeting number 4, Code Review Committee. Looking at the draft ordinance will be in July 25th of this year. We'll then have a community open house and online input for the community to be able to weigh in the ordinance in September, October of this year, and then public hearings going towards adoption with planning and zoning in November and December, and then city council in December and January. Okay. So that's the timeframe that we'll be on for this process.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, we're gonna move right on into,
So I would adjourn this meeting, Mayor.
we have to adjourn it?
Yeah, you need to adjourn the council meeting and the PZ meeting.
Move to adjourn
It's
the
been a
joint
pleasure.
We have to adjourn the joint meeting,
Yes.
and we're adjourning the meeting.